So if my husband killed a bunch of women, including my best friend, but he had like a legitimately good, ethically defensible reason to do so, and then he didn't kill me because he actually liked me, that's like worse. Like we're just gonna insult the memory of the women he did kill that way? Okay. The Wrath and the Dawn by Renee Ahdieh is a 2015 YA fantasy novel that retells the frame story of the medieval folklore collection 1001 Nights. It is also the worst fairy tale retelling I have ever read, the platonic ideal of everything you should not be doing. The romance is bad, and the fantasy or the fantastical elements are barely present, and at a much pettier level, it does all of the things that YA novels do that annoy me personally. And yet, somehow, in 2020, it made it onto a list compiled by Time of the 100 best fantasy novels ever written. When I started writing this review, I thought to myself, maybe I shouldn't be ripping into a 10-year-old novel that was never very high profile to begin with, even if I did want to be a little self-indulgent and lose myself in the pleasure that is ripping to shreds a bad book. But as I said, in the course of my very thorough research of a single Google search, I realized that The Wrath and the Dawn was never as low profile as I had assumed it was. I was shocked to see it on that Times list alongside titles like The Wizard of Earthsea and The Poppy Wars, and I don't know, The Lord of the Rings, which you may have heard of. 100 titles isn't all that many, like it seems like a lot, but when you're talking about of all time and you're putting texts on there that are from the Middle Ages, 100 is a really, really slim bracket. The write-up for the Times nomination talks about the book's courageous heroine and her determination to stop the senseless slaughter of so many women. So it seems like the gender angle was one of the reasons they chose this book specifically. This pop feminist sort of praise shows up in a lot of the reception to the book. Another article praises the author for weaving fresh gender narratives into her romantic and magical retelling of Arabian Nights to create a rich world that feels wholly original and modern. So given all of this praise, you would think that it treated its female characters with respect and did something original with the gender dynamics of the novel, right? But no, it was actually worse, like a lot worse than the original. You know, the one from the 10th century. I don't know, I just personally don't find it very empowering to go, well, I can fix him about a guy who's like currently actively engaged in femicide. Like, maybe sometimes we don't need to fix him. Maybe sometimes we should just kill him or something. So why was this book lauded as a feminist anthem while being not only just bad, but actively regressive in its portrayals of female characters? Unfortunately, I think I know why, and as a culmination of the general trends in YA at the time, it makes perfect sense. A post-Hunger Games YA novel written for the fantasy market that would eventually develop into the romantasy genre, there was no possible chance of it being anything else. The cards, aka the conditions and influences of the publishing genre, were stacked against it. So this isn't just a bad book, it's a historical artifact. Thus, this will be in part a critique of the adaptational choices in The Wrath and the Dawn and general review of the book, in part an exploration of what may have influenced these choices, and in part me just being snarky because I think it's fun. But first, real quick for the uninitiated, 1001 Nights is a collection of fairy tales of mostly Persian origin that was collected in the Arabian Peninsula starting in the Middle Ages. It's also sometimes known as Arabian Nights because that was the title of some of the earliest English translations of the collection. The frame story for this collection of sources includes a king whose first wife is unfaithful to him, so now he marries a new woman every day, has her for one night, and then promptly executes her the next morning so that she never has a chance to betray him. In order to stop the bloodshed, the daughter of the king's vizier, who's named Shahrazad, volunteers to be the next bride. She starts to tell him a story every night and then refusing to finish the story until the next night, so he keeps her alive for another day and another day and another day because he wants to hear the end of the story. The stories Shahrazad tells are the fairy tales in the collection, and by 1001 Nights, as you may guess from the title, and because you very likely already know the story, but by the 1001st night, the king has become wise and enlightened due to hearing all these stories. And also, he's fallen in love with his wife, so he decides to spare her life for good, and they just become normal married, for real. Also, in some versions, they have 3 sons together by this point, which, if you do the math, those pregnancies happen back to back to back, which, ouch. So you may at this very moment be reflecting that this man is violent and dangerous and an actual serial killer, and thus the story doesn't seem like a particularly appropriate one to adapt into a romance novel. And if you were thinking this, you would be incredibly correct, but Renee Ahdieh unfortunately was not aware. I paid $2 for this book, this guy, at a charity fundraiser book sale for the one very specific reason. I wanted to see how they would redeem the wife murdering serial killer in the name of feminism. I predicted mommy issues, a magical curse of some kind, or both at once. And I was right. And I really wish I wasn't right. Spoiler alert for like the entire book, which came out 10 years ago, so you've had time. But the initial plot or premise is a pretty straightforward adaptation of the frame story. We have the wife murdering man, here the Caliph of Khorasan, named Khalid, and the volunteering Shahrazad, Shazi for short. I'm just gonna keep calling her Shazi and the one from the original version Shahrazad to distinguish easier, and because Shahrazad is not a very natural thing for my mouth to say, and Shazi is easier. Thank you for understanding. So this version of Shahrazad, Shazi, has a very clear goal. She doesn't want to just survive, she wants to get close enough to kill the king. Partially to save subsequent women, but mostly because one of his past brides and victims was her best friend Shiva, and she wants to make him pay. Girls supporting girls, a clear goal for the main character. So far, we're good. I like this. So, how does Shazi plan to take out the monster that killed her best friend? I don't know, because she never actually gets around to it. Why not, you may ask? I don't know that either. She had many, many chances. So instead of killing this guy, Shazi starts to see his soft side and admire his tiger eyes, direct quote, and discover why he's killing all these women. Magical curse, like I guess. Specifically, magical curse cast by the vengeful father of his first wife as revenge because she committed suicide after the Caliph wasn't a particularly good husband due to, drumroll please, mommy issues. So while this is happening is a strong word. The book is pretty plotless, but while Shazi is chilling in the palace eating dates and pomegranates and complaining about how she can't do makeup, her childhood friend, who is also her first love, who is also kind of her fiance, is gathering a force to storm the palace and get her back. Also, at one point, her dad blows up the city wall with the latent family magic. I don't remember what that was about, but I don't want to go back and check the book. So yeah, that's the plot. And ostensibly, it's a retelling of 1001 Nights, except like, is it? Because after three stories get told after 3 nights. That plot thread is basically abandoned and it just turns into a romance novel. And perhaps if that romance was good, I wouldn't care about this, but as is, I have little reason to root for these people and many reasons to root against them. Shazi starts to soften towards the Caliph about 3 days in, way before she finds out about the curse, when he's still just the dude who murdered her best friend. I cannot express enough how contrary to girl code this all is. Like, it's kind of like going out with your best friend's ex. About halfway through the book, right here, page 230, she is calling him Khalid John, with John being a term of endearment similar to in English like dear or darling, and she's apologizing for daring to ask him why he kills his wives because it hurt his feelings. Oh, poor baby. I'm sorry. I didn't know you were sensitive about the time you killed my friend. I'll try to be nicer about it next time. When Shazi enters the palace, she already has a fiance who she's been in love with since she was 12 years old. But she forgets about him as soon as the Caliph starts to be vaguely nice to her, and I really don't understand why. I understand that from a writing standpoint, this was put in for drama because things get spicy when there's a bit of jealousy, but I don't know why she's falling for the emotionally unavailable serial killer when there's a perfectly good man already waiting for her. Like, there's nothing wrong with him. He's fine. He's fine. And what makes this all worse is that Shiva, Shazi's dead best friend, the one she entered this whole situation in order to avenge, was her first love's cousin. So she isn't just like slapping her own relationship in the face and leaving this guy for no good reason. She's specifically leaving him for the guy that killed his cousin. That's like disrespecting his whole family. Even though the intention behind adding the first love was to make the romance more compelling by upping the tension, It made it less convincing for me because how am I supposed to believe that Shazi's love for the Caliph is real when she abandoned her first love of many years within the week and for no good reason? I don't trust this girl anymore. I don't trust her emotional responses. I don't trust her to make wise or reasonable decisions in response to those emotional responses. And I really don't trust her taste in men. In the story, the role of this first love was to rally a force to attack the city and get Shazi back, but this role could have been filled by anyone, a father, a brother, a cousin. So with the love story having pretty cleanly discredited itself because the two love interests kind of cancel each other out, what's left is, well, not a ton. The main plot, the fact that she's telling stories, is never really given much attention to begin with. So let's take a look at Shazi herself. On paper, she is very much a strong female character, trademarked, as we are repeatedly told. She has, initially, a powerful and specific goal. She has a strong personality and a lot of opinions, and is a very skilled archer, even though that never really becomes plot relevant. She decides to take a trip to the palace training grounds to practice her archery, which is exactly what you do when you're here with aspirations of assassination and don't want anyone to know, but I digress. Point being, Girly Pop does indeed have some characteristics of empowerment.
Shahrazad is not your average damsel in distress.
Okay, Renee. Scheherazade in the original wasn't really a damsel in distress either, funnily enough. Even though she's in a lot of danger, Scheherazade wields a lot of power. She doesn't trip and fall into the plot. She's an intelligent schemer who instructs her younger sister to sneak in and ask for a story in order to bait the king into listening to one. In the face of a cruel and dangerous man who holds a lot of unjust power over both of them, the wisdom and cleverness of these two sisters allows them to manipulate the situation and slowly, carefully take back some of that power for themselves. Because Shahrazaad's stories serve as moral instruction for the king, he grows as a person due to listening to them. She's also elevated to the role of a moral teacher, which is another kind of power. The narrative is acknowledging that she has something he doesn't. He has something he needs to learn from her. That even though he is in the higher social position, she is in some ways above him. It's a very bad situation for her to be in, but she was the one to volunteer for it, and that was because she knew she could in some ways control it. By contrast, when The Wrath and the Dawn de-emphasizes the storytelling element, it strips Shazi of her source of power or control. She still does tell him stories, which is what initially piques his attention, but the storytelling element is no longer why the Caliph spares her life. He just does it because he likes her. Without the leverage of the storytelling, Shazi, unlike the Scheherazade of the original, has no means to control or manipulate anything and thus no power. When she stops wanting to kill the Caliph, she also stops having a goal and starts to just wander aimlessly through the story with nothing to do. She accompanies her husband to state functions and eats dates and learns to appreciate eyeliner. Really moving stuff. De emphasizing the storytelling element in this way also de emphasizes Shazi's intelligence. Sure, we're told she's smart, but she never has a chance to really show it off. I don't see it in the story. On top of having no narrative power, Shazi also never gets to utilize any physical agency. Even though we were repeatedly told that she's just so good at archery and she can make any shot, she doesn't even need to aim. She literally closes her eyes before she shoots because she's just that good. Except every time she's in physical danger, she's saved by, I hate to have to say it, a man. When the Caliph's uncle tries to execute her for, the bride's die at dawn reasons, the Caliph and his cousin swoop in to rescue her. When assassins come in to kill her, and presumably the Caliph, she is once again saved by, you guessed it, the Caliph and his cousin. In fact, after the assassination attempt, she is literally carried, bridal style, away from the danger.
Shahrazad is not your average damsel in distress.
Okay, Renee. Obviously, a 16-year-old girl who was specifically noted to be small and skinny cannot physically fight off multiple armed men, nor should she be expected to. And I wouldn't care that she doesn't, except the book already made such a big deal about how she's strong and stubborn and shoot arrow good. The Caliph calls her his Mountain of Adamant, a reference to one of the three stories that we do actually hear her say, because she's stubborn and powerful, and anyone in her presence can't help to be drawn by her. And that strength and power might be something he sees in her, but it's not something we get to witness. One of the only remaining means of influence that Shazi does have is that the Caliph likes her, which provides her with some safety and freedom, like in a harem drama. And the reason he likes her is because she's special. She's not like other girls. This specialness is something that's repeatedly acknowledged by other characters. Shazi's handmaiden talks about how she's the talk of the town and she's different from other people. The Caliph's uncle, the general, is like, wow, there's something special about this girl. You're enamored with her. She could be our hope. And not like other girls' plot lines in fantasy books usually just annoy me, but this time it made me actually angry. Because remember, this version of the Caliph isn't killing girls because he wants to, but because he has to. He has to kill 100 girls, or calamities will fall upon his city of thousands. And Shazia was one of the later girls. He only has a few more to go. He's almost done, but he can't bring himself to kill her because she's just so special and he just likes her so much. The implication becomes what? That the other girls weren't special enough to avoid being killed? That Shiva didn't have enough of a personality, she wasn't likable enough to make her worth living. They weren't feisty or talented enough, they didn't have likable enough personalities to deserve to live. If you reward Shazi for who she is instead of something she does, you then punish the other girls for not being her. And all of these complaints really exist for the simple reason there is no possible way to actually write a version of this story that adheres to modern sensibilities or fresh gender narratives, not unless you were to make it a horror novel. That's an idea, actually. But a socially aware romance novel like this one tries to be, the premise just doesn't allow for it. The Caliph wields far, far, far too much power for him and Shazi to be anything approaching equal in this relationship. Ahdieh tries to take away his culpability by using the curse to force his hand, and while that does make him seem selfish and stupid and irresponsible, it doesn't actually take away the amount of power he has because he can get away with killing all these girls. If the novel was interested in exploring how these power dynamics work, maybe this could have worked as a socially conscious adaptation, but it wasn't. It just wanted the romance. There's a scene near the end of the book where Shazi's first love, y'all remember him, he breaks into the palace to get his girl back, and he says, I'm not leaving the girl I love in the hands of a monster. Which is, like a reasonable thing to say when your girlfriend is in the hands of the serial murderer who killed your cousin. And in response, the Caliph's cousin, the captain of the guard or whatever he is, says, that's funny, one would think the girl had a choice in the matter. Which is a line that pays lip service to the idea of consent, that Shazi should have a say in her own fate. And I quite literally laughed out loud because this scenario is just beyond consent. He can kill her. He is allowed to kill her. Sure, she might have said yes to any advances that he made towards her, but how is she meant to know that he won't kill her? Like he killed a lot of other people. If she says no, how is a yes meaningful in this scenario? It's impossible for a relationship that exists in this context to be healthy. And in this throwaway line, one would think that the girl herself had any choice in the matter. There is just the reason that this book and the whole fantasy landscape it existed in really didn't work. The book predated romantasy as a genre, but it's this era of YA fantasy that would lay the groundwork for what would then become romantasy. And romantasy consistently claims to be sensitive towards women's issues while approaching the romance in a way that makes it really regressive and icky. But the shape of the story, the bones underneath, treat its female characters so badly that it makes those line level pop feminism quotes sound hypocritical. 2015, when The Wrath and the Dawn came out, was well within the YA boom started by Twilight, and well within the boom of strong female characters that was sparked by The Hunger Games. Shazi owes a lot to Katniss, her bow and arrow, her younger sister, and her initial motivation of her love of Shiva, which is reminiscent of Katniss volunteering for the games to protect Prim. But in The Hunger Games, these things had meaning. The romantic element and Katniss's relative narrative powerlessness and the love triangle, if you want to call it that, they all had meaning. They were there for a reason. You look at the YA books that were published in 2015, you can already see the influx of fantasy romances that would turn into romantasy, although not all of these books take the approach that I dislike. Sequels to The Falconer and The Kiss of Deception and Winter's Kiss. Wow, these YA titles really liked their kissing. We also had the fourth Throne of Glass book and the first installment to A Court of Thorns and Roses, ACOTAR, which are now considered adult but at the time were shelved with the teen books. Believe me, I checked them out of the school library myself. So Wrath and the Dawn wasn't unique in how it approached romance. It was one of the many well-intentioned titles that wanted to seem progressive but didn't put in the work of thinking about how these progressive values might actually be reflected in the story. And I guess at that time they thought teenage girls were too dumb to be able to identify what equality looked like in a relationship. Because so long as the heroine made some little speech about how strong she was, or, better yet, as long as her love interest informed her how strong she was, it didn't matter how bad the romance actually was and how powerless the narrative made her, the book was empowering and they'd call it a day. And that's why this book made it onto that Times Top 100 fantasy books list. It is culturally significant in that it's a good example of how that era tended to handle the fantasy heroine, even though I really dislike this approach. That and Sabaa Tahir, who debuted in the same year as Renee Ahdieh and seems to be friends or at least friendly with the author. She was on the advisory panel that compiled the list, so make of that what you will. Tahir's An Ember in the Ashes also made it onto the list, though I think it deserved it a little more. Ahdieh herself seems like a really sweet woman who is earnest in her attempts to write a compelling heroine. She said in an interview that Shazi is strong in many ways, and that she likes writing well-rounded female characters, and when a female character is strong in ways that aren't strictly based on traditionally male notions of strength. Okay, Renee. As a mixed race woman in an intercultural relationship, Ahdieh is passionate about diversity in literature, hence why she drew on her husband's Persian culture to inform the world building of Wrath and the Dawn. In the years since, she's written a sequel to Wrath and the Dawn, another YA fantasy duology based on Imperial Japan, and a quartet about vampires, with her adult debut, a contemporary literary fiction novel set to release later in 2025. I hope that she's continued to improve as a writer, and that the way she approaches gender dynamics and power structures has evolved with time. But I wouldn't be very surprised if it hadn't, considering the continued popularity of ACOTAR and its acolytes. I'm getting really disappointed with the way that fantasy novels written in the last 10 years managed to be less progressive than the medieval texts they were based on. I don't think we should keep letting them get away with it. In 2020, an article announced that The Wrath and the Dawn was being adapted to film. There's been no word since then, so it's more than likely the project just died in development hell, but it's equally likely that it's still slogging through production. And I wonder, would a film actually weave in some fresh gender narratives, or would it just be more of the same, maybe worse? And now that I've talked at length about my more serious critiques, let me make some petty complaints. I would like to end this all on an amusing and petty note. The descriptions of clothing and makeup and people's physical appearances in this book were borderline uncomfortable. Bronze arms, hazel orbs. Please stop. I should not have to read the word orbs in a published book. Despina, the Greek slave handmaiden, is described as having eyes bluer than the Aegean because she's Greek. Did you guys know she's Greek? How does Shazi, a teenager from fantasy Persia, even know about the Aegean, never mind what color it is? Why does Greece even exist on the same plane as fantasy Persia? I was unsettled by Despina's existence. Like I'd been reading Game of Thrones and a character casually mentioned that they were from New Jersey. Okay, scratch that. I stand that the Aegean descriptor is dumb, but I just googled it and learned that Khorasan, which is the name used for the capital in the Caliph's kingdom in the book, is the name of a historical region of Iran. So I guess fantasy Greece and fantasy Persia just exist on the same realm of fantasy Earth. Thank you, Renee Ahdieh, for teaching me one thing. I still don't like that with fantasy real countries. It feels strange, although I will grant that it feels silly when people make up a fantasy name for what's obviously an analog for a real country. So maybe this is a lose-lose world building scenario. I need to think about it more. All of this being said, there was a single plot thread that I did enjoy, and that was the one where Despina, the Greek handmaiden, was secretly pregnant by the Caliph's cousin, the captain of the guard or whatever. And she isn't telling him because she doesn't want him to feel strong armed into marrying her. I'm sorry, I live for like soap opera gossipy storylines like that. The drama. If I ever find the second book in a used bookstore or like find it conveniently in the library up for grabbing, I might take a look just to see how this storyline resolves itself. Unfortunately, hate reading is fun, and hate analysis feels pretty productive. And that was all that I can think to say. I started filming this way too late in the day, so now it's really dark and the lighting is absolutely garbage, but I don't really have the time to carve out and do this another time, so my sincere apologies. Also, all of my sources will be in my description. I try to find sources for absolutely anything I referenced, so look there if you want to know more things. And if I talked about something and you can't figure out which source it came from, please ask and I would be happy to blab at length about it. Thank you very much.